Welcome to the Fictional Mindbender. I'm taking a look today at the perception and philosophy of Avatar's Colonel Quaritch. Now, the reason I'm doing a video on this particular character is because of the opinions I've seen on him, oftentimes portraying him as a two-dimensional, one-stroke villain, basically. Someone who is too cut and dry, too simple, and just obviously a bad guy with no sense of nuance whatsoever. And I saw this after I saw the first Avatar movie, and as well when I just saw the second Avatar movie as well. And this is an opinion that I cannot disagree more with, and I'll explain why. To begin with, I'm going to give a spoiler warning that if you have not yet seen Avatar: The Way of Water, why not? The movie's been out for months now, so anything I say here is pretty much already online already, but this is just a fair warning. Other than that, let's get into it. So real quickly, Quaritch was a former Marine who was serving on Pandora as a security officer for the RDA as they were strip mining the planet. The era that this is set in is the 2150s, so it's about a century and a half into the future. As a society, humanity has developed technologically pretty well. They can now travel into deep space, and their military technology has improved vastly, apparently. However, their moral compass has not developed that well, apparently, with corporate greed and still kind of running rampant and seemingly running the higher ends of society. Having said that, Quaritch served in some wars that had gone on Earth before they had went to Pandora. And while he was on Pandora, he encountered some of the fiercest resistance he's ever seen, where he first got his wounds in combat with 3 distinctive claw marks across his face. And he was basically put in charge there because the local species there called the Na'vi have been waging guerrilla wars basically on the RDA because they were strip mining their planet. To them, nature was sacred, and these people were basically killing nature and tearing it up and tearing up their homes. So they would often do hit and run raids. And Quaritch was responsible for the protection of RDA's equipment and economic output from these raids. Enter the protagonist of the first 2 Avatar movies, Jake Sully, who is a crippled Marine who is brought to Pandora as a replacement basically for his brother who had died. And he is basically sent in as a double agent into the Na'vi tribe to basically get them to play ball with the RDA. But as everyone knows, a whole Dances with Wolves thing takes place. He falls in love with the culture. He rejects the human exploitation of the planet and fights a war with the RDA security forces. And during this war, Quaritch, who had already destroyed one of the holy sacred trees for the local Na'vi tribe there, is killed in the process. Well, Jake decides to switch consciousness to his new Na'vi body from his crippled human body, thereby completely embracing his new identity as a member of the Na'vi rather than of the human race. Now, this is where Quaritch becomes kind of interesting, because from the get-go, he does not strike me as one-dimensional. And you can see this in how it depicts the head of the RDA operation, who immediately comes off as this one-note businessman. All he talks about is money and the money that they can get from mining the minerals of the planet. The only nuance that he gives is that he is trying to get the Na'vi to play along rather than just wipe them out entirely. But beyond that, he can pretty much care less, and all that matters to him is the money. And it's pretty simple, pretty straightforward, corporate, greedy, businessman type person. Now, this is not Quaritch. Quaritch is a Marine. through and through. Therefore, a lot of his mannerisms, how he talks and how he behaves, is basically a Marine. And in fact, the main motivation that he gives for what he's doing is to protect his people, protect his unit. And at first, to me, he seemed somewhat likable. He seemed like a commander who actually cared about his troops. He wasn't just sending them into the jungle to get mindlessly slaughtered. He cared very much about setting an example for his soldiers, and if he had to, he would lead the way. And in fact, the only time when he starts to become more villain-like, in my opinion, is when he realizes that Jake Sully has betrayed him. And from this, you get a clear sense of what drives him, which is a powerful sense of loyalty, something that is also very classic Marine. That a fellow Marine would betray his own is something that is unforgivable to him. In fact, it's not as much as he regards the Na'vi as uncivilized savages, as much as that they are simply in the way of a mission and a project, and he conducts his mission to the extremes that he needs to, but never tries to exceed that until he realizes that Jake has betrayed him. Now, this is not a question of right and wrong in terms of was Quaritch right in burning down the tree on Pandora, or was he right in, as in the second movie with his clone, well, kind of a clone, coming back and hunting down Jake Sully's Na'vi half-human children. This is more of a question of the motivations of what is driving him and how both movies are displaying this. Oftentimes in movies that want to show the military as an evil, malevolent force, the main commander is often seen as somewhat of a borderline psychopath, if not a total psychopath, running around in an officer's uniform. Someone who does not care about his fellow human beings, someone who does not care about doing the wrong or right thing, someone who only cares about getting the mission accomplished, or at worst, just wants to kill people. And this is not Quaritch at all. Quaritch does not show a murderous intent to slaughter every Na'vi he comes across. On several occasions in the first movie, he shows them respect, crediting them that how highly dangerous they are, how much of a skilled warrior race that they are, and he respects them for that. Regardless though, they're still in the way of his mission. Now, obviously, by the time of the original Quaritch's death, it had become very, very personal, and is in fact, Quaritch is killed by Jake's wife, Neytiri, who took the destruction of her home tree extremely personally. Of course she would. Now, Avatar: The Way of Water takes this direction with Quaritch into a new direction, because now it's Quaritch, but it's not Quaritch, in that it turns out that he had downloaded his consciousness into a digital platform so that it can be then uploaded into a cloned Na'vi body that was prepped for him before the final battle of the first movie. Now, this clone is made aware that he is a clone, that his original died, and there's actually a sequence where he visits the original battlefield and finds the skull of his progenitor and kind of stares at it for a minute, kind of hard to tell what he's thinking, and then proceeds to crush it in the dust. From that point on, he is verbally saying that he is not his progenitor. He is his own identity, his own person, if you will. And that his whole reason right now for fighting at this point is to avenge his fallen Marines that Jake Sully had killed during the final battle of the first movie. Now, this version of Quaritch shows a little bit more extremes in that he is willing to burn down villages, and it does appear on 2 occasions at least that he is ready to kill civilians in order to find Jake, because that is his primary purpose. He's not doing it for the sake of the human race. He's not doing it for the sake of the RDA, who by this point have been replaced by a full-on military invasion. He's doing this just to get revenge for his fallen men, and he says that. Now, this is not the typical motivation of a villain, all right? Most villains would, they would go after for revenge, but at the same time, they would be very exclusive about it and would do anything and everything in order to accomplish that. And this version of Quaritch is not doing that. He still holds some of his military discipline and, I would argue, morality from his original template. He still values loyalty more than anything, and he still believes in violence to a point. Having said that, the Way of Water introduces a new aspect to that, in that both him and us as the audience are introduced to a secret son that apparently who was on the planet beforehand during the first movie. This son, named Spider, had adopted the Na'vi culture just as Jake Sully had, and was actually more or less considered an adopted part of the family, which would be more salt in the wound for Quaritch, I imagine. Spider pretty much grew up with the stories of what his father had done during the First War, and he does not hold him in high respect at all. In fact, he despises him. However, after he is captured, he develops a kind of loose yet still tense relationship with his clone father. He clearly does not buy into the violence happening to the Na'vi as well as to the rest of the planet that the human race represents, even if it is for their own survival. Yet at the same time, he is starting to show more and more openness to this person that he's starting to recognize as a father figure. And in response, Quaritch is actually slowly but almost surely starting to soften up a bit in terms of how violent he is willing to be in the presence of his son. Now, by the end of the movie, after his final battle with Jake, again, he is left to drown. Spider reluctantly saves him and then abandons him, and he is left calling out his name. So clearly, this version of Quaritch had come to recognize Spider as a son. And that means that this war that he has with Jake Sully has now become already that much more personal, because Quaritch had already killed one of Jake's sons as well. So it's beyond personal at this point. It's a literal family feud. Now, a lot of people have criticized Quaritch, again, for being a one-note villain, so someone who's out for revenge and just being this hyper-violent person and making these threats. So I'm going to kill you if you don't kill me, and etc., etc., etc. And in my opinion, these criticisms are missing the point. Again, that Quaritch is a villain, but he is an extremely nuanced villain. He is not doing evil things for evil's sake, like, for example, the Whaler in The Way of Water, who, again, like the Corporal from the first movie, is clearly doing what he does for greed. Quaritch is living by a higher code of honor, or at least his interpretation of that. He's living by a higher code of loyalty. Just as Jake is loyal to his family, Quaritch is loyal to his fellow Marines, and by the end of The Way of Water, his son as well. Those are the things that drive him, and that's why his war with Jake Sully and his family is so deeply intense and personal. We're not talking about someone who's trying to rule the world or something along those lines. We're not talking about even someone like, say, Avengers Thanos, where he wants to do some sort of universal goal and is willing to do anything to do it. This is something that is very insulated, it is very intense, it is extremely personal, and those are the motivations for Quaritch. And all this being from his philosophy and worldview that was drilled into him from his progenitor in the Marines of loyalty and honor. And again, this is why everything he says, how he behaves, what he does is something that we would see in real life with an actual Marine. And it was kind of amazing to me that a lot of people were kind of missing that. My first question upon reading and hearing some of these criticisms was, have you never met a Marine before? Because my brother was a Marine. So I can tell you firsthand, this is exactly how they act. This is exactly what they sound like. This is exactly how they behave. And they don't see themselves as the bad guys. And yes, you can say that for any kind of cinematic villain, really, I suppose. But in real life, it's the same as well, and especially for soldiers. There isn't a soldier alive, today at least, who sees what they do for their country, their nation, or whatever as doing a bad thing or an evil thing. It's either for some higher sense of loyalty, or some sense of loyalty at least to their company, their nation, or their unit. And again, this is Quaritch through and through. So hopefully, if they continue with this franchise, they will continue to expand on that concept. I've already heard some other YouTube theories about where this can go with this character, and some of them I find very, very interesting in terms of how this can parallel with Jake Sully's own journey. But having said that, tell me if you happen to agree with this assessment or not. Do you think he is just a one-note villain, or do you think he is more nuanced than people take him to be? Go ahead and leave the comments below. And otherwise, thanks for staying around and have a good day.